I do want to talk about where this goes, because I think a lot of people are there's kind of levels of this. So everybody got in hysterics because they're upset about the possibility of LCS not having imports anymore, which is obviously, or opening up all the imports. So this was obviously where they would start, but that ignores the fact that you would have to get rid of region locking for all regions. That is just true. People were not focusing on that topic of conversation. And then the other thing people aren't focusing on is, where is this even coming from? And to my mind, the frustration here from the LCS owners, and why many of them are looking to, you know, try and remove this rule, presumably only for them, even though that would never happen, it would happen for everybody, is because there is still a lack of international competition where they can show their stuff, and LCS teams' ability, these team owners' ability, not even LCS teams. Understand that this is coming from a place of vanity. Reggie and Jack want to be the best team in the world. Now, I don't think they particularly care that they're an LCS team or not. I don't think that's their goal. I think their goal is to be competitive on a global stage because it gives them potentially more money and prestige, which is totally reasonable. If you're a very competitive person, I would be in that same boat if I was still a team owner. But what we're focusing on here is that is the core issue. And it's a problem. We've reached a problem within League of Legends where we still have insufficient international competition compared to most other major esports. And because of the region locking, these teams have kind of hit their peak. Like, we're not going to see like TSM or LCS or Cloud9 viewership get larger. And they've kind of tapped the available pool of players that they have to improve their rosters, even with some of the biggest signings we've ever seen in League of Legends history, like Perks coming over to LCS. But that's not enough because they still want to win. So to me, the core of this issue is really that they don't have the capacity to win under the current system. And there's a lack of international competition for them to prove that they are good. And obviously, this has probably also been stoked by the pandemic. If I'm Jack, I'm super salty that Cloud9 didn't get to compete during spring at their peak last year at MSI, where I think they legitimately had a shot at making finals. I think that's not outrageous to say, given their form at that point in time. And that might have been Cloud9's best opportunity to place well at an international event ever.
And honestly, that might have been, I'll be like the really extreme perspective that I think is true. That might have been the only chance NA has within probably the next several years, unless we change things. Like, just to be super honest, when I look at the current landscape, where players are landing after this free agency period, like, that's just what it looks like.
Yeah. And so for me, my level of frustration is, as I alluded to before the break, I want to watch all the best players competing against each other. That is what esports has always been for me, because I come from a time before region locking existed and everything was just international. And I grew up watching StarCraft on OGN, where there were 1 or 2 non-Korean players in these leagues, right? And it was a miracle when Jinro is making top 4 in GSL. And I didn't care because I just wanted to watch the best competition. And it was a fun storyline when Jinro did that. But to me, it was not really about Jinro. It was just about watching the best players. So I still want that. And I understand that regionalization has been key to Riot's development of these leagues, and it has been very successful, and I acknowledge that. But in my mind, the time has come for us to create a region-free league, super league on top of everything. And this wouldn't be like Champions League where the existing teams qualify. This would be an entirely new franchise structure where teams have to apply.
Like Overwatch League. You have an Overwatch League for League of Legends.
Yes. And to people,
but obviously not with all the baggage of all the negative things, which means the premise.
And people will say like, oh, well, Overwatch League hasn't been doing well, and that's true. But they didn't develop the grassroots regional
They didn't have a huge game with a massive player base, of course.
They didn't have the player base, you know, and I'm not saying, I'd say change nothing about LCS except for do what Danon said and maybe roll back the region free, residency rules, right? So you keep that there, and presumably you're keeping the fans of LCS happy who do want to watch these North American talents. Now, what you do when you create this Super League is you have all of these leagues that people can pick from. And people will say, well, Overwatch League was mostly Korean. You weren't paying attention. Actually, what happened with Overwatch League is that Western players became better, and we saw the playing field level out. The last 2 champions has been a mixed Korean and Western roster. And Koreans were very dominant at the start.
Was North American as well a couple of years
ago.
Yeah,
Koreans were very dominant at the start, but once you put all these players into the same league at the elite level, you actually saw significantly more parity because there was a chance for those guys to learn and Korean solo queue. If you have everybody over there or in the same region, it also levels it up. One thing that we saw with Overwatch League was when all the best players came to live in LA for the first 2 years, is that solo queue in NA went from the worst to the best. So the practice was exceptional in North America for the teams because there were, 100 professional players that were suddenly all playing solo queue at the same time because scrim blocks are always scheduled for the same time. So when they were out of their scrims, they would just go into queue and it was really good. So it's not that people wouldn't be able to compete, guys. And in fact, we might see early Korean or Chinese dominance, but my theory would be that in a few years, first off, we would definitely have European teams good enough to compete in that league. You would have full European rosters or European rosters with an American player or two, because they're already in World Championships of League of Legends at 2 of the last 3 years. So I think that this would actually be the best thing. And if you actually did a format where you were moving all of the teams to like Shanghai for a couple months, you run a tournament, and then you go to Los Angeles and you run a tournament, then you go to Berlin and you run a tournament, right? You can hit all of the major regions, and you actually have a way to watch all the best players where it isn't a full-time job to see one of 60 different teams across the major regions, which is just, it's ridiculous that we have to go through this when all I want to do is watch the best competition.
Well, I'll chime in there. There's because that was one of the solutions that I was going to propose, but it's not the one. It's not the one I would naturally lean into. I think the way League of Legends is structured, they have managed to create something that is similar to the Dota setup, but not as inherently destructive to the esports fabric, in the sense that they have one huge event, right, a year, but because they have a franchise league around it, and it's not just a fucking wilderness for the other fucking 48 weeks or whatever, right, per year. People don't just think about Worlds. They have a league structure. They have to keep the lights on in the meantime. You've got to beat your regional opponents, get ahead of them. There's all this stuff that's going on. You're on a regular featured broadcast. So there's lots to think about. If you come in and do this Super League, and you said, and you would keep LCS going as well, this is what you end up with here is you get like, a TSM, a Team Liquid, a Cloud9 from North America. They go in, your G2, your Fnatic, etc. They go in, you get your best Chinese teams, your best Korean teams. And then all of a sudden, like the teams that are left behind, all you've done there is essentially create, in terms of how you farm talent, I think you'll see a bigger disparity in terms of the ability. Like the teams who are playing in that league, you're absolutely right. Like we saw with the Overwatch League. Well, I use that term lightly. And obviously no one really saw it. We heard about it. Right, but like we saw, North American players, European players, they got better. They did close that skill gap that when it was all Korean. We thought it was all going to be Korean lineups initially. But the problem would be if you had those other leagues where it was like you didn't even have a TSM or a Cloud9 to play against. What do you think happens to those teams that don't even need to raise their game because they're suddenly the top dog? Not because they leapfrogged a team, but because that team just said, "See you, we're off to go make more money." This is one of the big resistances we've had to the famously touted European Super League, not only because it would devalue in football, that is, not only because it would devalue the Champions League, but it would also devalue every domestic league that would potentially feed into it. Now, bunch of Emirati money and everyone, those teams, those like 16 teams or whatever it would be, they're set for life. They've got a license to print money. Their games would, command a bigger fee for the pay-per-view model that we use and all that. But what it does to the fabric of the game is a huge concern, and this is why people have been resistant against it. I think a much better solution would be for Riot Games to just simply introduce, scattered over the course of a season, some international competitions, some legitimate international competitions that aren't just like a one-shot, aren't just a tournament bracket, but, are a bit structured like a league, do take place over a period of a week rather than a weekend, and give an opportunity to teams. I don't know how they would get there, how you would decide that, but give an opportunity for those guys to basically have regular, but not too regular, so you devalue worlds competition against better regions and better teams. We've already seen a bit of that with stuff like All-Stars and everything, but I think, if you look at the daughter circuit, how they've moved to, they identified the destructive force that was TI, having one tournament a year that everyone cares about, and no one gives a fuck the rest of the time, and they started bringing in the majors. Be good for League of Legends, maybe, Riot Games, to come back to some of those tournament organizers that they absolutely fucked over when they made LCS. Maybe get back to them and say, hey, do you want to run an international tournament for us? Like, they're eating well over there at Riot. It's all Tencent owned now anyway. Who gives a fuck about all battles? So I think that would be a much better solution. I think a Super League, it's good in the short term for the teams in it, but it kills grassroots league.
So I don't know if that's true, because we've actually seen like the French league grow substantially, even though it is basically a feeder league in principle for LEC, right? And I think that there's enough current stability in many of these esports circuits to support a 16-team Super League on top of it and still keep everything compelling for regional fans, right?
I would say this, right, which is, I'm not really on the side of like whether or not this would do well in the league, but I mean, Monte's original premise of if you want to reverse engineer a world in which, without just letting everyone buy all the Koreans, a North American or a European team could be the best in the world, it is essentially, the most obvious thing is increase the exposure time to the best players.
Yes.
I mean, essentially, I can tell you from other games, this is how it works. When we referred earlier to StarCraft, right, in those days, when if you made a tournament of the top 16 teams in the world, players in the world, 15 would be Koreans. There's a reason the one non-Korean was my boy Nanawa. He was going and living in Korea for like half the time, so that he'd take the beatings for the first 3 months, then he'd get good, then his level would be high, and then he could compete. Similarly, in Counter-Strike, we know this only too well, because we've actually had like a reduced aspect. We essentially had two regions. We had Europe, which was the best, we were the Koreans, and North America was the underdog region, which maybe the absolute best team could possibly have a chance at winning the European major, as it were, right? That's like League of Legends now. Counter-Strike 2 years ago, the best team in the world was a North American team. It was Team Liquid. And part of that reason why, by the way, is because they didn't just stay in North America, beat all the North American teams, then once a year go to a major and go, holy fuck, is that Fnatic? Oh my God, fuck, that's Astralis. They were playing those guys every weekend.
Yep.
So, listen, if you weren't as good, you'll never be better. But the point is, it just removes all those things of like, I'm an underdog, or like, wow.
Look at
the
Luminosity SK roster, the Brazilians.
Let me just throw this last thing in as well. I'll say this as well. We even have a mad control group, which is last year. Because last year, when Americans couldn't travel and play Europeans, and by the way, there's a double element to that, which is, since we have an open circuit in Counter-Strike, you also get to practice the Europeans if they come to an IEM in Chicago or San Jose, because they're going to be there for the week, so it improves your practice, kind of like Monte's example of an Overwatch League and the solo queue going up. So basically, when we had 2020 and there was no international travel, not only did the Americans, when they finally came to Europe at the end of the year, no joke, like drop half their level, but in the meantime, they all said, without like a tournament circuit where, the European teams come in and practice, they said the practice just got worse and worse and worse and worse in North America until eventually, you actually had like 3 or 4 teams and everything else was just a waste of time. So like, that's not like a hard and fast rule, but I would just say those trends do imply to me, if you ever want the best European, North American player to be as competitive, he has to play the Koreans and the Chinese, even if it's just psychologically. Like I always said this about my boy Doublelift. If Doublelift really played 10 fucking years playing Uzi I and all those guys every 2 months, he wouldn't be shitting his pants like 7 worlds in, would he? He'd either have gotten over it or he'd be the biggest choker of all time. It'd be one of the two. Whereas in this scenario, like realistically, he got what, like 10 shots in it his whole career? 10.
Yeah.
Like that's not as big a sample size as people think.
Well, I was gonna say, I usually pick myself the idealist, but you guys are maybe being a little bit more excited about this idea than I am. I think my struggle is like looking through the politics of how decisions are made for League of Legends. This seems like some weird
pipe dream.
This is like a weird alternate universe I'm living in, like being rewritten by Marvel.
I typically try to live in
Marvel-
an universe as
Marvel-
regards
you
League of
got-
Legends from Riot
Look,
Games, believe it or
look.
not.
Look, as
and like manifesting a thing. But where I'm at is looking at it saying, I don't think you can do much like structurally to the global calendar unless you have 3 of the major regions on board and the global team. for League of Legends. So when I hear, Super League, when I hear like these big structural changes that have impacts on these like technically permanent franchising partnerships that we just laid, like we literally just franchised LCK. I think LPL is like implementing their like salary cap right now. There's so many things going on that like even if we pretended to say we're going to do this over the next 10 years, it wouldn't manifest. Even if you took your vision of what we want to do and implemented it right now and said we're going to fast track it as fast as we can, we still wouldn't even get there in my opinion in 10 years. So I'm having a really hard time attaching or relating to the idea. And really look, what does that speak to about our sport?
Yeah, look, I think you could do it. Like as a fan, I want this because I want one place to watch all the best players, because it's infuriating to me that I can't do that. And it is.
I like the way Monte keeps going back to that. He doesn't go to like, it'd be great for the
No, it's good for Monte.
Why can't I just watch all the best games and know everything in one week without having to watch 700 games? This is unfair.
I used to be able to do that in 2014 when I was casting LCK.
I
got to watch all the best players in one place. It was awesome. It was the best year of esports ever. I just want that back. Yeah, transparently. Okay. Now, here's why this is terrifying to me. In order to do this, you would have to franchise, right, the Super League. Now, Now, this is good for Riot, but probably not good for every other esport or the esports scene in general, in that at this scale, Riot, why they would do it, I think, and why they could do it is because you can play Kingmaker at a global scale that would be unprecedented in this industry.
$100 million buy-in.
$100 million buy-in. When you apply for the Super League, you must, have X number of like professional sports partners. We want to see that, in a way, what people don't know is that when franchise hit LCS and LEC, what it did was it created a shotgun wedding where many of the teams had to go out and acquire new investors to become attractive to Riot, right? In order for them to approve their franchising. Now, this would do it at an even bigger scale, right? You would say, hey, European teams, you'd better get Barcelona, Real Madrid, on your, like, as part of your company in order to give us the best possible chance of franchises, or this Premier League team, etc. Now, this would jump the industry pretty significantly in terms of investment, but also what's scary to me about this potentially, I mean, I don't know, I don't think it's going to happen, but if it did happen, what would be scary is that these new esports teams would be by far the biggest on the planet, and they would be very, very beholden to Riot, which would probably create a lot of problems in other games, would be my number one fear.
Well, I mean, not to mention we go back to where we started with Riot Games, which is the first thing. You're not allowed to have a Dota team. Let's codify that. If you want to run a tournament that has multiple games, like with the Intel Extreme Masters, you now have to create an entire separate tournament circuit if you want to do that. We won't have our rivals adjacent to it. And Riot has already had at some point in esports a disproportionate amount of influence. And every time Riot has a disproportionate amount of influence over anything, whether it's a professional esports organization or a female employee, they abuse it. So to me, it seems that this would be an absolute nightmare for the industry holistically.
It could be, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, when you look at it that way, that's, not the way I want to go at all. But I'll also just add this. I think actually there's a financial aspect to it where Riot Games might not be as good as it sounds. $100 million buy-in sounds great on the surface. Maybe 20 teams from all across the world, all the big regions. You throw a Brazilian team in there as well, just so you get the viewership. Yeah, nice. And trust me, they can definitely raise that kind of money in Brazil as well. But then the problem you've got is that worldwide, you're probably talking across all of the leagues, approximately 115 teams, right? On some level, and all of those people have paid millions already into a system where they think they're going to get maximum value because they've handed their money over to a developer. Well, if you create a Super League and you say, sorry guys, we were only really interested in these 20 organizations the whole time, they just pack up shop and go to another game or get out of esports altogether. And probably what you've done is, without realizing it, you've created a wonderful golden tipped peak of the pyramid, but the next 2, 3, 4 tiers below all start to crumble. Yeah. And like, listen, what you're talking about, I don't know if it's because your mindset is a little bit different because you did go over to the Overwatch League, and I know to a certain degree you believed a lot in that project in terms of how it was structurally and some of the things that they were trying to do over there. But I think in about 2 years, when we watch the Overwatch League collapse, much like the CGS before it, I think we're going to basically get a written textbook lesson that more people are paying attention to than CGS as to why these types of leagues are usually doomed for failure. And what keeps esports upright isn't having a consolidation of power at the top with big brands and all of that. It's actually having a healthy grassroots
I agree.
scene above all.
But that's why I think this is different than Overwatch League, because we already have a decade of building up these grassroots scene, and we've seen that CBLOL is not killed by the fact that it's not a tier 1 League of Legends competition. You know, the Vietnamese league is not killed by the fact that it's not a tier 1 competition. And I don't think that LCS or LEC or LPL or LCK would be killed by losing some of their players or potentially some of their teams to a larger league. In fact, I think that this is the right way to do it, Richard, as opposed to what Overwatch League did, which was take the top of the pyramid and try and, put it on top of nothing. I think we have the foundation of the pyramid.